Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. Hope everyone is well. So the offseason is starting to settle in for us a bit. We have a better picture of who's going to be partaking in Penn State's 2025 campaign at this point from a roster standpoint. Still waiting to learn who that next defensive coordinator is. Hopefully you followed our coverage at lions247.com this week. It has been a whirlwind kind of a week in terms of draft declarations and transfer portal entrances, and Penn State getting some really good news about roster reinforcements in the form of veterans who are staying put for their fourth or fifth or sixth or seventh even years. We covered a lot of that on our last episode of the podcast, which dropped on Tuesday. Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen joined me fresh out of a long season. We took a look back at the Orange Bowl, gave some final thoughts on what we learned during the playoff run for Penn State. And then we broke down a lot of those early week decisions like the Singleton, Katron Allen announcements, Deny Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, and Smith Bilbert staying on the defensive line, and ultimately our reaction to Tom Allen leaving for the Clemson job. By now, if you haven't noticed, he was introduced as the Tigers defensive coordinator during a press conference down there in South Carolina. He leaned heavy on the opportunity to be closer to his family down there, and it also sounded like he was rewarded pretty well financially. $2 million is where he's at, and that's what it sounds like it's probably going to take for Penn State to land one of its top defensive coordinators. And we'll break down some of that, and we'll dive into a lot of the transfer portal class for Penn State because we are to the point. We're turning the page. You're saying goodbye to a lot of familiar names. You're getting introduced to a lot of the newer ones. During the shuffle of that Notre Dame matchup and us going to South Florida, we miss really being able to spotlight a couple of pickups for this class. And so we're going to do that with Tyler Calvaruso, who joins us right here on the Lions 24/7 podcast. Tyler, good to get you back on board. The season is finished. It was a 5-month-long ordeal, and it was a long one that Penn State fans have hoped for. But along the way, we didn't get a chance to check in with you as regularly. And as we get into our off-season mode a little bit here, hopefully our listeners will stay with us. You're going to hear more frequently from Tyler Calvaruso because we'll have a lot of recruiting events coming up. We got camps to get into a little bit later on when we get into spring. And, of course, along the way, the transfer portal is going to do its thing, and Tyler covers that for us at lions247.com. What's going on, man?
Good to be back, man. Appreciate you having me. We're definitely going to be diving into this off-season recruiting coverage really head first. And I'm looking forward to getting back and talk to you. It's always a good time.
Yeah, you've got a lot of confirmations already for some upcoming visits to campus. So there's going to be those junior days on the calendar. There's a lot of bubbling talent in the region from beyond the region that's going to make it to campus. A lot of guys starting to narrow their list a little bit as junior years reach the second half. But we'll get into that on a future episode of the podcast. Plenty of that over at lions247.com for our VIP subscribers right now. But we got to begin, Tyler, with the ongoing defensive coordinator search for Penn State. Tom Allen takes that Clemson job. That goes public on Monday. He's introduced down there by midweek. And Penn State, there's been a few names on that radar as we've done some reporting, as there's been some other reporting. Tim Banks was a name that we were interested in early on in the process, a former Nittany Lions safeties coach, spent 5 years in Happy Valley, very effective recruiter in his native Detroit area. Got a lot of guys that we've become familiar with, like the King twins, Jalen Reed. He was heavy in bringing them to campus, but he got an extension out of Tennessee. His name was also floated around for the Clemson job. Deonton Lynn is another name that was really starting to get buzzy for us, picking up midweek. Ultimately, though, he gets an extension from USC to stay put there with Lincoln Riley. Kind of a precarious situation there, Mr. Calvaruso, because Lincoln Riley's on a very hot seat, you'd imagine. James Franklin, this situation back at Deonton Lynn's alma mater, I think we were talking off air, really would have seemed to line up for him in some important ways in terms of maybe having some career stability back where his college roots are. He's got a father who's a coach in the NFL, working in DC area, so it's relatively close there as well. And you also know that James Franklin's got job security, whereas your boss in SoCal does not maybe have that beyond 2025 in Lincoln Riley. Before we go further, what did you make of not so much the Banks one, because before that really got going, it got figured out by Tennessee, but it felt like we may have been inching towards a Deonton Lynn reunion. We know James Franklin thinks highly of him. I think he's 35 years old at this point, a couple years under his belt as a Power 5 defensive coordinator. But he's going to stay in Los Angeles. And so that leaves Penn State now kind of reviewing the situation again, I don't want to say they're regrouping. Bryant Haynes is a name that we have heard has been in the mix there as well, Indiana's defensive coordinator. But he just received a 3-year extension from Indiana in December. He's making almost $2 million per season. He's also been with their coaching staff and their head coach, Kurt Cignetti, at 4 different schools at this point. So a lot of loyalties in place, not all that different than what we saw with Nittany last year at Kansas and their head coach. But Tyler, just bringing people up to speed in case they haven't been tracking it and making sure I'm setting the stage for you. How is everything kind of being up in the air right now impacting Penn State's efforts in the transfer portal and ultimately as they continue to try to build momentum with recruits of various classes?
Not a whole lot, quite frankly, with you, especially when it comes to the high school front. Transfer portal, I do believe there was a little bit of a direct correlation in the sense that Penn State hosted NC State transfer Bishop Fitzgerald for a visit shortly before Allen's departure. And he profiled as a fit at safety, and we'll get a bunch into the portal talk later, but he profiled as a fit at safety, but his relationship was largely with Allen. Allen goes out the door. Fitzgerald winds up, ironically, committing to USC to play for Lynn. So this is it hasn't, based on the feedback I've gathered, talking to recruits. Caden Gebhardt was when I caught up with, who's a top linebacker target in the 26 class. He was pretty straightforward with me. This departure changes nothing when it comes to his interest in Penn State. A lot of these guys, they commit. We always talk about committing for reasons that go beyond one specific coach. A lot of the targets that are on Penn State's 2026 board at linebacker, they're taking a bigger picture approach from a viewpoint standpoint. And I don't think it's having an overwhelming impact on those guys right now. One other thing you have to keep in mind is whenever we talk about coordinators and recruiting, this is going to apply to any coordinator on James Franklin's staff at Penn State. A lot of it has to do with closing. The position coaches in Franklin are going to take center stage on a yearly basis, on a cyclically basis. It's going to be them leading the charge. Coordinators, they're as hands-on as they can be, but they play a big role in closing. And Allen, he was important in that regard, like any coordinator Penn State will have on its staff. The Nittany Lions, they shifted their on-the-road fall recruiting approach. So the coordinators weren't even out on the road during the fall. Andy Kotelnicki and Tom Allen were not out on the road during the fall. So given that Allen wasn't here for an extended period of time, he didn't get, a whole lot of face time with certain targets. Most of his recruiting activity came from an on-campus perspective, on-campus visits during official visit season in June and game day visits during the fall. Now, yes, he was out on the road this past spring, shortly after he was hired, getting to know Penn State's top targets, played an active role in that regard. But when you're only around for a year, you can only build so many relationships to a certain level. Guys are looking beyond Allen. And again, just overwhelmingly, I don't think it's having any sort of negative impact or anything like that. It caught some guys off guard, but now they're moving forward and they're looking forward to see who Penn State brings in as its next DC.
Yeah, I guess the downside, if you have to find them for playing so deep into the year and getting to be one of the Final Four teams competing for a national championship, is the carousel has kind of figured itself out in some important ways. Like a Ryan Walters comes to mind. If you time this out a little bit differently, Purdue's head coach, who was let go at the end of their season, he's considered still a very strong defensive mind, still relatively young in this industry as well. And so Ryan Walters, who has Big Ten defensive coordinator experience at Illinois before he was Purdue's head coach, well, he ends up being Washington's defensive coordinator. He's sticking in the Big Ten. He's going out to the Pacific Northwest, replacing Stephen Belichick, and this is how all the dominoes are falling. But Belichick was the DC. He's joining Dad in Chapel Hill, and now you've got Ryan Walters as DC. Well, if you time this out a little bit differently, and if Walters was a free agent right now and hadn't freshly signed a contract that has a buyout, how much is his name really realistically out there for Penn State? So we'll keep track of this. We're into the second half of January at this stage. It's Friday early afternoon as we record right now. I believe Manny Diaz and that news broke on a Saturday morning that winter. So we're going to stay tuned. We work on weekends around here, and at Lions247.com, we'll have you covered whenever a defensive coordinator is ultimately hired. And when he is introduced, we will be there sitting with the microphone in our hands, ready to ask that new new coach questions about his new job. For now, let's turn the page and go to a bit of a reset in a position room that has been under the spotlight for some time now, Tyler. That's at wide receiver. Marcus Hagans remains the receivers coach. We actually saw a picture of Penn State, some staff members with James Franklin out in Southern California visiting a school this week, and he was part of that group. Coming off of a game in which Penn State was the first non-service academy offense not to produce a reception for a receiver, and that happened in the Orange Bowl. Rough way to finish the season, Tyler. And now we got, again, a reset of sorts. Harrison Wallace, the leading receiver for that group, and also Omari Evans, the leading speed threat, the vertical threat for that group. They are both in the transfer portal. They are both actively visiting as we speak right now. I think Harrison Wallace is maybe on campus at Ole Miss. I know Omari Evans has visits lined up. They're exploring their options. They won't be part of Penn State's equation. Thus, that means Liam Clifford, who had 18 catches as a redshirt junior, he has 39 catches in his career. He's the only member of this room that has at least 10 catches in a Nittany Lions uniform at this stage, Tyler. We got a lot to figure out. You and I are going to talk about some of the potential solutions, but can you discuss the departure of Omari Evans, Harrison Wallace, two guys coming into the season, and at various points of the season, Harrison Wallace had 100 yards and 2 touchdowns before halftime of game 1. Omari Evans had some big moments early, kind of disappeared for a while, had some big moments late, but ultimately neither had a moment in the Orange Bowl outside of Omari Evans being the intended target on that late interception. What do you make of these guys leaving at this stage of their career and ultimately it not materializing the way they, and I'd imagine the Nittany Lions, would have hoped to on the field, whether it was in 2024 or perhaps in 2025?
Yeah, no doubt Penn State would have loved to get more out of those guys during their time on campus. And going into the offseason, you kind of got the sense there was going to be a reset of sorts at the wide receiver position. We knew that as soon as the transfer portal opened, really, because we knew right off the bat Penn State was going to be aggressive going after wideouts on the addition front. And on the subtraction front, you got the sense some guys were going to go seek opportunities elsewhere. The fact of the matter is, wide receivers are always going to be having conversations about, is there a better situation for me elsewhere in one facet or another? Wideouts, for me, that I feel like that's a conversation that's taking place no matter how successful you are as a pass catcher in your current situation. There's always going to be at least some dialogue. That dialogue occurred with those two, and they decided to seek greener pastures elsewhere, and they're already on the road making visits. I don't think either move or either departure necessarily caught me off guard. You just, again, you had that sense going into the offseason. This wide receiver room for Penn State was going to look a heck of a lot different in 2025. Evans, I think I expected even more so, in a sense, based on some buzz behind the scenes. Wallace, I mean, the wide receiver play was what it was. In 24, he had his moments. I think he's a really talented kid. I think Omari Evans is a really talented player as well. I think those guys will be able to land on their feet at their next stop, but Penn State needs more out of the wide receiver position. So maybe a reset moving forward is the best thing for all parties involved.
Omari Evans was so tantalizing, and we heard from James Franklin back in August during preseason camp. He said, this is a guy on our team that by the time we get to the end of the year, it could really be a different buzz around him. It could really be a different discussion around him. And Omari Evans, through non-conference action, was proving that point. Through those 3 non-conference games, he was coming up with big plays. Rattler was looking in his direction. They were picking up big chunk yardage, touchdowns, penalties. And then Big Ten play came, and it just didn't carry over, whether it was the offensive schematics or whether it was Omari Evans' limitations as a receiver against power conference opponents and Big Ten opponents. Ultimately, though, you kind of do the math and take the autopsy of what his season was like here in 2024 and briefly into 2025. Against 3 group of 5 opponents and West Virginia in that opener, he had 10 catches for 260 yards and 3 touchdowns, so 26 yards average. Then against 10 Big Ten opponents, plus SMU, plus Notre Dame in the playoffs, 11 catches, 155 yards, 2 touchdowns. It's a 14-yard average. And again, just 11 catches scattered across those 12 matchups. So do I think Omari Evans is probably going to find himself a bit of a hot market? Probably, because people were sitting at home wanting to be part of the playoffs and seeing Omari Evans catch a deep ball against Boise State. And, if they've been paying some attention to Penn State, they've probably seen some of the bigger plays he's made. they haven't been paying a bunch of attention game by game by game, may not be aware of the kind of chunks of time that have gone on where he hasn't really been an impact for the offense. And when I think it comes to Harrison Wallace, I picked him as my breakout player of the year heading into the year when we did our predictions. And I felt pretty validated when he was at like 120 yards and 2 touchdowns before halftime against West Virginia. And while he was ultimately the most reliable target for Drew Aller, and he showed that durability in a way that he hadn't in years past, he only missed 1 game, the regular season finale. I don't think he eclipsed 65-ish yards really the rest of the way. He was a steady presence. He was a reliable presence. He wasn't a game changer. And so those guys, I think, will find green pastures because that's what the way NIL market is for a wide receiver. They're coming from a high level. People will probably view Penn State's offense and say, well, there's at least a 2-season sample size now where receivers aren't producing. How much of that stink is on the program versus how much of that stink is on the members of this room? You look at the guys who left the room and went elsewhere last year. Keandre Lambert-Smith had a big year for Auburn, explosive season. They didn't make a bowl game. They were under 500. Everybody else was a bit player or wasn't all that effective in their particular role. So we'll see what Omari Evans and Harrison Wallace do next. But I understand why the collective response, Tyler, from our board and kind of what it feels like Nittany Nation has been like, well, good luck. Maybe it's best that we both part ways and figure out our situations separately in 2025. And now the situation for Penn State, they've got to figure out. You got to factor in those 2 transfer receivers. And for our audience out there who may forget a little bit about Kyron Hudson out of USC and Devontae Ross out of Troy, bring us up to speed on what they bring to the room, because it sure seems like they need to come to campus, hit the practice field in March, ready to run with a role.
With Ross, it's speed. With Hudson, it's ability to make contested catches downfield. I think that's where those 2 carry the most value. I like both additions, and I know there are going to be some Penn State fans listening to this who are saying, yeah, we've heard this before about the wide receiver additions in the portal. I'm not telling you this just to make you feel better about what Penn State is doing. I truly believe these 2 guys can really help the wide receiver room in 2025, and I'll get into why right now. Devontae Ross has gotten it done. When Troy played high level of competition, he produced. He produced against a Power 4 secondary, which is notable because you see some group of 5 receivers in the portal who they have lacking numbers against P4 competition. And I've downplayed that here on the podcast in certain instances because you have to take into account offensive line play, quarterback situation. There are a lot of things that go into an individual performance from a group of 5 wide out against a Power 4 secondary. But we've seen it with Ross. We've seen how he does it. He took the top off that Iowa defense, which Troy played at Kinnick this past fall. And, I think he'll be able to continue that at Penn State. I truly do. Now, his size, does that limit him to a slot role or leave him primarily on the inside? I believe so, but that doesn't really mean much in terms of potential impact. You don't got to be some dominant, big-bodied X wide receiver to be an impact player in the Big Ten. You could be that speedy, shifty slot guy. Tez Johnson, that's a name Penn State fans are playing familiar with. Not saying Devontae Ross is going to be Tez Johnson 2.0 coming out of Troy as a hell of a wideout, but we've seen that path, and I think Ross has it in him to be a legitimate contributor in 25. And then there's Hudson, who, you get a receiver in the portal who knows the Big Ten as well as anyone from his time at USC. And I've said this once about him, and I'll say it again. He played a lot for USC in 2024 as part of a wide receiver room that boasted a lot of talent. That says a lot because there were a lot of different directions USC could have turned at that position throughout the fall. And Kyron Hudson was a mainstay in that rotation. He's very good down the field. He will go up and win you some really difficult balls. Drew Aller doesn't necessarily throw a lot of those passes, but if he wants to take some more shots downfield into tighter windows, areas of traffic, Hudson is a guy where you could, throw it up a little bit and have some confidence that he's going to go get it. That's something that Penn State, didn't really have a receiver in 2024, if we're being blunt about what we watched throughout the year. So I think these 2, there's a lot of value in both. And then there's the spring window. And I think Penn State's going to be very active in the spring transfer portal window. Now, they're not going to bring a guy in just to bring a guy in. They didn't do that during the winter. There was some really good talent at receiver in the portal. A lot of it was top end and operating in a different realm than the area Penn State likes to operate in. Beyond that, though, wasn't a whole lot. You're not going to force the issue just because you need help at a position. They're going to look for fit in that spring window. I expect them to be active. And quite frankly, it wouldn't even surprise me if we do wind up with another receiver joining the fold around that period. It just really wouldn't.
A few things coming off of your commentary there, which was really good and really detailed. So Tez Johnson, the last couple of years at Oregon, and we saw it firsthand in the Big Ten championship game, what he was able to accomplish against Penn State's defense. But 2,000 receiving yards, 20 touchdown catches in 2 years at Oregon after his career at Troy. But his best season at Troy, he had fewer than 70 catches. He never had more than 860 yards at Troy and never had more than 4 touchdowns. Devontae Ross is coming off a season with that same program in 2024, 76 catches, 1,043 yards, 11 touchdowns on the year. So a little bit more productive at the lower level. If he can even come close to what Tez Johnson has done with the Ducks, then you will take that 10 times over for the Nittany Lions staff. And then I think you're right with Kyron Hudson, a guy who's made contested catches against power conference cornerbacks in the past. We saw him get into the end zone against this Penn State defense back in October. I don't think much is going to come as a surprise with him. And he's been kind of on the inverse of a lot of these guys in the Penn State room. He had a lot of trouble breaking through as a 4-star, as a local Southern California prospect, because that wide receiver room has been one of the best position rooms for that USC program, even if they've dealt with inconsistencies, even if they dealt with a really traumatic entrance into the Big Ten this year. Receiver has been a strong point for them. And so he had to kind of work his way through early, more of a classic breakthrough year 3 into year 4 kind of scenario at USC. And now looking to bank in on year 5 with Penn State. We've got something up this week, by the way, over at Lions247.com, breaking down the highlights of Kyron Hudson from his last year with USC. Some really nice highlight plays in those highlights, by the way. And I just want to bring this up. So Penn State, like all programs, they're working within a reality where NIL budgets are a thing. You've got to kind of establish what you're able to pay a roster on a given year. With Harrison Wallace and Amari Evans gone, 2 guys that they were on the books in some way, shape, or form this past year. They were getting paid. That's probably going to be a key part of what they're looking for out there in the open market is looking to make the most of the rest of their college career from a financial standpoint. But when you look at Penn State, you take those 2 guys, and I'm just thinking about classic budget. If you were staffing any business, those 2 guys are off. If you were still to allocate that money towards a receiver position, it just feels like Penn State, it shouldn't be a reason or excuse for them in terms of being able to afford a quality receiver. Because if we're talking about 2 guys here and you turn in that to 1 or into another 2 receivers, I get it. Everybody wants to pay for a receiver across college football. It's a very good position to be good at right now if you want some money. But it seems like Penn State should be fairly well positioned because it's not like they're trying to tack on these guys to what they already have. They just lost 2 starter quality players on their current roster to the portal. And you'd imagine the money that would have been allocated towards players like that would be available to someone who may be able to step in and step up.
I'm 100% with you on that, 100%. But when I look at the wide receiver position specifically in the portal, when it comes to spending, there's a lot of guys who, unfortunately, for programs like Penn State that are in the market for help at the position, a lot of them fall into that buyer beware category. Just because the former 5-star wideout is in the portal and it sounds great, and he's got the raw talent going back to his high school career, and Penn State has actually had successful former 5-stars in the portal on the defensive side with guys like AJ Harris. But with the receivers, it's so tough to nail down what exactly you are going to get. They're going to be in a position to be competitive financially for a receiver in the portal. No doubt about that. No doubt. But, there's always this very in-depth vetting process. Then that goes into every portal target, but at receiver, even more so, because you just got to make sure that guy is going to come in and be a fit on and off the field. That's why I think that the spring window is going to be a good time for Penn State to pounce. I think the receivers who pop into that spring window where Penn State is going to be in a position to make a move, they're going to be hitting the portal for a couple of different reasons. You've got the guys who either committed to a program or signed with the program. Then there was a coaching change. That tends to apply to the younger guys. There was a coaching change. Things didn't necessarily go as planned. Maybe you didn't fit into the system at that program, but you might be a fit at Penn State. guys who maybe, they're just looking for a different kind of utilization in an offense. They look at Andy Kotelnicki's system. They say, hey, look, my strength's playing that. I could go to a place like Penn State and be successful. So I think if that kind of talent pops into the portal from the financial side, like you just brought up, you could be really competitive for a top-end guy. And I anticipate they will be if that opportunity presents itself.
Just a little bit more notes here on the receiver end that you may have missed during a very busy week. There was a bit of an exodus beyond just the obvious. You also saw Tyler Johnson and Mekhi Flowers hit the portal. Those are two guys from that 2022 class. That also once featured Christian Driver, who transferred out to Minnesota last year. Amari Evans, of course, was in that 2022 class. Only two guys remain from that group at this stage on the current Nittany Lions roster. You got Anthony Ivy and Caden Saunders. Both will be redshirt juniors in 2025 if they remain with the team. And then you look at that 2024 class, the three freshmen who came to campus all took red shirts. Josiah Brown was restricted to the practice field all season long. Tyseer Denmark had a cup of coffee. He caught a touchdown to finish out the regular season. Had a bit of an experience at this level, but not much of one. Preserving that red shirt was not a factor in the postseason as we thought he perhaps could be. And then Peter Gonzalez, unfortunately, we did not get to see him involved on the practice field in year one because he was injured during preseason camp. A guy that we liked a lot and has that physical frame that you're really intrigued by on the perimeter. We'll see what it looks like for him resurfacing in 2025. But let's finish on receiver here with you, Tyler, because they do bring in another freshman class and 4 men in this one. But as we've talked about, personally, I'm highest on the one who's not getting to campus until the summer, Matthew Outen. And I know how difficult it would be for in your scenario where you pick up a transfer after the spring window. That's great in theory, but you got to digest Andy Kotelnicki's offense by the time you finish out August. And really, you got to digest that offense by the time you get on the field in August if you want to earn a starting job. So last time we saw that play out with Dante Cephas, it was quite a process. And I know that not everybody's going to be built the same, but I think that's a risk you run. And I'd say the same with Matthew Outen coming to campus in the summer. I am personally curbing my enthusiasm a little bit because I know what it takes to find your way onto the field for significant reps in the fall when you're not around for winter conditioning and for spring workouts and everything that goes into your preparation. So is there a receiver in this group? Maybe it's Outen for you, but that you see could potentially work his way into the back half of August, giving Marcus Hagans, giving James Franklin, giving Drew Aller a lot to consider?
It's still Outen for me, and a lot of it has to do with the physical traits. Does he still need to develop as a receiver? Yes, and that's something that we haven't shied away from discussing. He's an elite athlete, no doubt about it. Still coming along as a receiver though, but he has physical traits and testing numbers from a speed perspective Penn State hasn't brought into its wide receiver room in a little bit. Now, how exactly he adjusts to going up against Big Ten level DBs in practice on a daily basis coming up from Virginia, that will probably be the determining factor in what kind of an impact he can make right away. I think he has it in him. And from everything I've gathered, everyone thinks he's on the upward trajectory in terms of his development as a wide receiver. He's not just going to be some freak athlete when it's all said and done. He's going to be a fine-tuned guy once Marcus Hagans and the staff get to work with him. So I believe, for me, it's still him. You look at some of these other additions. Kobe Howard's good with the ball in his hands, so there's a lot to like there. That's a really coveted skill set that Penn State had with its wide receiver recruiting.
Pretty important, man. Pretty important part of the skill set.
You say that. It's funny, though. We've seen some guys who aren't that good with the ball in their hands. So,
by the way, Kobe Howard was sidelined for a big stretch last season. We did see him practicing a bit. We had mentioned this in the recent weeks, how we saw a wave of freshmen. Lyric Samuel, the skinniest dude in the field to finish out the season. He got some reps in during the year, but physical progress is going to be key for him. And ultimately, you're also looking at Jeff Exeter Jr. making the jump up from McDonough School. Yeah,
Exeter's big. I think he's around 220. So
he looks like you could confuse him for a linebacker for sure.
He's got that build to him. He's ready from a physical perspective. Now, where will he be from a speed and technical perspective as a wideout? That's going to be the tipping point with him, at least from an early on in his career point of view. And you said it with Lyric Samuel, his upside immense, but he's got to get stronger. It's going to be a year in the weight room with Chuck Losey, and I think he's going to put in a ton of work there. And with Howard, you kind of felt for him as a senior, losing a lot of time to injury after, that leg injury that he suffered early in his high school career that cost him a chunk of his sophomore year going into his junior year. And his recruitment kind of changed after that. We touched on it. Penn State was one of the schools that stayed on him after that. He enjoyed his time at Shaman and Madonna with Beckham Critson. When he was on the field, he was productive. He got back just before the end of the year, and that was nice to see. It was good to see him out there at practice. So I think it's a solid wide receiver group. I know some people are going to go on the commitment tab and look at the rankings, and they'll have some issues, but I think it's a good group. And I think the 26 group that Penn State has on board right now, I think it's even better. I'm higher on that group than what we have from a ranking standpoint, to be completely honest with you. There's still so much time in the cycle for evaluation, so I expect some of those guys to rise. But Jasir Rogers, LeVar Keys, and Jaquaden Guilford, I mean, the junior seasons they piece together, exactly what you want them to be.
But they're not going to help out with Drew Aller and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen's last rodeo, and that's the focus for us at receiver for the moment. We're going to have a lot to talk about the future of receiver with you as this year continues. There's no doubt about that. It'll be at the forefront of a lot of conversations we have regarding this offense when 2025 season rolls around and we get a little bit closer. For now, let's shift focus over to linebacker, which is you're going to have to replace a not just a really important presence on the field, a productive linebacker in Kobe King, who neared 100 total tackles on the season. I believe he was a second-team All Big Ten performer. He certainly earned those accolades, and he's also someone who was the defensive captain for this team throughout the season. You had KJ Winston carrying that title as well, but he wasn't available by the time he got to Big Ten play. He's the guy who had the dot on his helmet, was communicating with the defensive coordinator from the booth, and so really an important integral figure with this defense. He has declared for the draft. He was a redshirt junior. He had an opportunity to come back for a fifth year on campus, but he will head out, turn pro. We wish him well in that decision, and we will be keeping tabs on these guys, and we'll have pro day coverage here down the road at Lions 24/7. We're not bidding them farewell forever, but in terms of this current roster, Tyler, it leaves a hole. Because Dom DeLuca played a lot of football. There's no doubt about that. He's proven what he can do on special teams and on defense, and he's going to remain a player. He announced this week he's sticking around as a redshirt senior. And then Tony Rojas, fair to say he probably played his best ball in the postseason of his sophomore years, first year as a starter. So all of a sudden you're feeling a little bit better, a little more settled with him going into his junior year at the position. But beyond those guys, it's like, who is ready to step up? Tamir Robinson seemed like he might be the obvious candidate going into the season. He had injury issues. It wasn't really able to capitalize as the year went on. And they really just rode those top three linebackers as often as they can. A lot of times they played five defensive backs, so they only had two linebackers on the field. Anthony Specca got involved, but not enough to burn his red shirt as a freshman. Dakari Nelson moved from safety to linebacker. Played a bit, but really not all that much on defense, enough to gauge where he's at as a linebacker. And then Kari Jackson, who was also a freshman with Specca, was banged up and unfortunately wasn't able to contribute on the practice field much this year from what we gathered. So, Tyler, that leads me to say, is the transfer portal an obvious path that Penn State needs to explore? Are they already doing that? And what do you think the market looks like for them to bring in a startable option in 2025?
Probably a road we're going to have to go down once the new DC is hired, just because you got to account for scheme fit in terms of positional need. Maybe one coordinator you bring in needs another linebacker, wants another linebacker. Maybe the other coordinator you bring in says, hey, look, I'm running something like a 4-2-5. I want more of a hybrid safety linebacker skill set kind of guy. That impacts, I believe, at least where things go in the portal at linebacker moving forward. And yeah, man, I mean, Kobe King, I could say a lot of things about him. It's a big loss. I felt throughout the year, as much talent as Penn State had on the defensive line in the secondary, Kobe King was on that short list of guys you couldn't afford to lose. He was just so impactful in the middle of that defense. You have the green dot for a reason, right? He was that guy for Penn State, and they're going to miss him in 2025. I do think Tony Rojas, I'm looking at him at least as a guy who could take that next step in 2025 and be that big-time impact linebacker that Penn State needs. But beyond what's in-house right now, but guys like Rojas, I anticipate Dakari Nelson will take the next step in his development. I think Anthony Specca has come along nicely. Tamir Robinson, as you mentioned, he's a guy we've gotten some pretty glowing reviews on internally. So I think all of those guys will factor into the equation. But outside of Alash, I think, again, spring window, you monitor what's out there. Because right now you're kind of in a holding pattern. You got to see where you are going to take things from a personnel perspective before making a big move like that.
We mentioned this earlier in the week on our first podcast this week, but they do have a stabilizing presence right now as you're losing your peer leader in Kobe King, as you've lost your defensive coordinator, Tom Allen, this week. You got Dan Connor, who has been a really important part of the heartbeat of that linebacker room as a defensive analyst, and with some changes in the NCAA rules that allowed analysts to be involved on the practice setting. He was front and center every time we got a look at those linebackers in terms of drill work. And we've heard from several guys, including Rojas, about the developmental angle that Connor has contributed toward with them. So we'll see what they can do in terms of organically grown talent. But it would seem to me, Tyler, that it is something that, especially as you get a new defensive coordinator on board, and maybe where you're getting him from, he's got a roster he'd like to circle back to and bring some guys with him. There's a lot of possibilities there, but it sure seems like something that we should circle back to once they get a defensive coordinator in place, because it's not a spot that you want to be thin at for LBU, especially considering what you've got in front of you, what you already know it's going to take to win a national championship. And Tyler, like we'd finished with the wide receiver conversation, this freshman class, I know it's not complete yet, but we did see one of those guys on campus a couple weeks ago leading up to the Orange Bowl, and that was young LeVar Arrington. We know his papa was something special here. There's been some buzz that he's going to be wearing number 11 and take that over as Abdul Carter moves forward, just like his daddy did. But at the same time, we are not really sure what it's going to look like on a Big Ten football field when he's asked to go, take on a blocker and take on a running back, and what that is going to look like on the practice field when he's working up against a really good Penn State offensive front and these running backs they have. But is he the guy you're circling because of his presence, because of the pedigree, and because of essentially his frame? You wonder where that can go in the next 8 months.
Yeah, for me, he actually kind of has to be the guy I circle, because Alex Tesh is still, he suffered that shoulder injury that cost him really the whole back end of his senior year. And it's not the first time that shoulder's been banged up. So he's still working his way back to 100%. I think as good as Cam Smith is, he probably still has to pack on a little bit of size before we're at that point with him. So for me, it's got to be LeVar Arrington, but he's raw. I think Tom Allen's assessment before he left town of Arrington, I think it was a good one. I think that as tantalizing as his upside is, as high as his ceiling may be, he is still a raw player, as is any incoming true freshman. That's just the nature of the beast. He still has some things to learn from an intricacies perspective, playing the position. He did a lot of different things throughout his prep career. He's very versatile. He can play on the edge. He could play as your traditional stand-up linebacker. So he's probably the most physically ready. But where does that leave you, between the years? He's been praised in that regard as well as a heady player. So I think he'll be able to pick up on this new defense pretty quickly. But again, he is still raw in certain areas, and he is going to have to develop in certain areas. Still the guy I have circled, though.
Yeah, we got a lot of stuff circled, and we've got a long time to get to preseason camp, and we got a couple months before we get into spring ball. But there are already those storylines surfacing at every different position group, and we will spend a lot of time on this podcast sorting our way through that. Let's go through some of the new faces that are on campus, and actually we'll start with one that's familiar. I shouldn't say they're all on campus yet, but this is the transfer class that's currently constructed. We already talked about those two receivers, Kyron Hudson out of USC, Devontae Ross out of Troy, but kind of lost in the shuffle of the Orange Bowl week and the Orange Bowl loss and all the other stuff we were monitoring with the roster and the coaching staff. There have been some movement out of the transfer portal with guys coming to Penn State and committing to Penn State. And King Mack, who came to this campus a couple of years ago as a top 100 prospect, burned red shirt as a special teams contributor and as a backup component of their safety plan, spent last year at Alabama. He was a post-spring transfer, one that really stung at the time, and then you lost KJ Winston, and it felt like it stung a little bit extra over the course of this season. Well, he is back in the fold now, committing to Penn State. King Mack is back. Talk about it, man.
If you're a Penn State fan, you should be really happy about this. I really believe that. I loved King Mack coming in. He was actually one of the first down-to-the-wire recruitments I got to cover here with you guys. So
down to the wire, yes.
Special place with me, man. He as soon as I got here, he was bang, just like that, between Michigan State and Penn State. He might have been my first crystal ball pick in favor of Penn State going back. But
you two have a history. You two have a history. But so I know you're excited to have him back in town. But the reason why there was so much attention, just remind everybody, because he was just a bit player at Alabama last year. He had some like 15 tackles over the course of the season. But down in South Florida at St. Thomas Aquinas, powerhouse program down there, he was a menace. I mean, he was arguably their best defensive player. He was probably their best special teams player in terms of blocking kicks, returning kicks for touchdowns. And then he goes in the track field, and he's one of the top performing sprinters in the state of Florida, where they seem to just grow elite sprinters down there. And so this is a guy who had the prospect pedigree. To get out of South Florida was a huge, huge win for Penn State on the recruiting trail. Seemed to be on track with his trajectory. He departs in Alabama. Do we pick up where we left off with his trajectory, or do we have some questions now that he's going into year 3 at the college level? Doesn't have a lot of game action logged. And you've got a guy in Dejon Lane who says, hey, I've been around the program for a year now. I've played some football with KJ Winston banged up. And I know you're a year older than me, King Mac, but you're going to have to earn it through me because I want that job that Jalen Reed just walked away from.
Oh, he's definitely going to have to earn it. He's not being handed anything coming back. And you have questions, just not really from a skill set perspective, but more how's he going to settle back into the room and the system. I don't think that's something Penn State's going to have to worry about when it comes to scheme fit. I've said it during his high school recruitment. You put King Mac over the top as a one high safety, he's going to produce. You move him down into the box on certain formations and plays, depending on down and distance. In the nickel, he can make plays. So he's got that tool set where you can look at him and say, we plugged this guy in a multitude of ways, and he's going to make some plays for us. I think it's going to help him a lot going back to a place where he knows a lot of the people. He knows Anthony Poindexter really well, of course, knows Terry Smith. So that secondary as a whole, you're walking back, you know everyone. It's a homecoming. So, yeah, I think that, again, nothing earned or nothing guaranteed. Going to have to earn all his playing time, but I think the trajectory it's still heading in the right direction.
We got a couple linemen to get to as well here who have jumped on board, and one out of Michigan's program who moves within the Big Ten Conference, a little bit closer to home. Owen Wafel out of the Hun School in Princeton, New Jersey, the same program that produced former Penn State starting tackle Caden Wallace, who's now with the New England Patriots. But Wafel was a guy who was, relatively considered one of the top prospects in New Jersey for the 2024 class. But we're not talking about King Mac status, a year removed or 2 years removed from being a top 100 recruit. He was just outside the top 50 in defensive line rankings. He was a high 3-star coming out of the Hun School, spends a year in Ann Arbor. Now he makes the move to Penn State. We're talking about a defensive tackle. Talk us through Owen Wafel, who everyone's going to call Owen Waffle and have to be corrected on for the next several seasons. But what is he adding to that position? Because that's a spot. Yes, you saw T.A. Cunningham at the portal, but there are so many unknown commodities who are young at DT right now, and Penn State's going to need some to step up this upcoming year, and I guess you just kind of throw his hat in the ring.
It's an upside play. He was all indications where he was making some positive progress behind the scenes at Michigan. The buzz was there. He's a really strong kid. Physically, he is where he needs to be an impactful Big Ten defensive lineman, and look, he's got 4 years of eligibility. There's a lot there for Deion Barnes to work with. So it's an upside play. Maybe he factors in 25, maybe he doesn't. But regardless, Penn State really happy with that addition because you're adding a high upside player to your room. You can't turn away from that. One with a younger brother who's very interested in Penn State as well. And I've been clear that wasn't a package deal. But, hey, look, it certainly couldn't hurt.
One other name I wanted to get to with you. We talked about Anai White previously on this show. He's a defensive end, edge rusher out of Philadelphia, former top 100 recruit, spent a couple years down at Texas A&M, dealt with a knee injury, kept him off the field for a large chunk, got back for, I think, just one game last year. Still learning about him. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add on him, Tyler, but one of his former Texas A&M teammates has made the commitment also to Penn State as a transfer, and this is one we haven't talked much about. That's TJ Shanahan, 300-plus snaps last year as a guard, started some action as a redshirt freshman. Again, you're getting a few years of eligibility with Shanahan. He's a guy who Penn State and Troutwine offered as a high school prospect out of Austin Westlake High School there in Texas. He's going to come long distance. He's not coming to what would be a clear path to an obvious starting job. We'll get to that in a second. But, again, anything to add on White that we didn't touch already? And then with Shanahan also out of Texas A&M, I mean, this feels like a significant step again for Phil Trautwein, who just keeps taking forward momentum with that offensive line room.
Nothing necessarily new on White. You're really just banking on and kind of hoping, the health is where it needs to be. And he comes along and shows you why he's a top 50 recruit coming out of high school. Offensive line, it wasn't the biggest position of need for Penn State in the portal this offseason, but TJ Shanahan might be my favorite get of portal season for Penn State. And I'll lay it out like this. 3 years of eligibility remaining for an offensive lineman with legitimate SEC experience. That feels like an eternity for Phil Trautwein on the developmental standpoint when you take a look at what he did with Nolan Rucci. I know Rucci's a tackle. Shanahan's an interior guy. Look what he did with Rucci in less than a year's time. He has 3 years with TJ Shanahan. There is so much he could mold there. Shanahan's around 6'4", 330. He comes in with the billing of being a extremely physical mauler. There are instances where, since he's still young, he kind of lets that big, overwhelming frame take over. His technique falls by the wayside a little bit. But that's an area where, especially when it comes to footwork, we've seen Trautwein thrive and really turn some guys around. So I take upside into account. I take years of eligibility remaining into account. I take his position coach into account now for sure, because Phil Trautwein's track record of development recently, especially, undeniable. TJ Shanahan's a guy I think could come to Penn State, really get coached up, and make an impact in 2025 and beyond. Even if he doesn't crack the starting lineup in 2025, I think he's going to play a part, and he's going to be an important part of that room. And as an upperclassman, I think you're looking at a potential high-impact starter.
As a former 4-star prospect coming out of high school, and I think also you look at him as a true 3-position potential across the interior type player, could contribute at center during his career, at guard, and you factor in what you've lost and what you haven't on the offensive line. We talked about this earlier in the week when Mark and Daniel were on with me, but you didn't lose Nick Dawkins. He's opted in for a 6th year with that COVID eligibility. He's a team captain. He's your starting center. Huge from a leadership standpoint, huge from a tone-setting standpoint. You did not lose J.B. Nelson. And I think a lot of people were wondering, how does he fit into the equation? He announced this week that he is staying with the Nittany Lions, and he's somebody who has, starter level potential at both guard and tackle. We've seen him start 8 games for this team at guard. We've seen him play in a pinch at tackle. And I think they believe he has NFL ability at these positions. And so he's around. He's played a lot of football. And you've still got Venga Ioane after a full year under his belt playing some really good ball. And you've got these tackles now. Anthony Donko working his way off an injury. We'll see what that timeline looks like, but he'll be back to push Nolan Rucci again. And on the left side, you've got Drew Shelton, who I think turned some heads as a full-time starter. And where does Javen Williams fit in to this scenario now? A former 5-star player we've seen at guard and tackle. And so, Tyler, there's a lot without even getting to the freshman class, and they've got a few of them on campus. And again, you just feel like anytime you're shining that spotlight towards Phil Trautwein's room these days, it's for a positive conversation. And we just can't say that for every room in the building right now, but I think that's a big sign of where Phil Trautwein has taken his culture and been able to acquire talent and develop it. So kudos to him. And Tyler, anything else to add before we say goodbye, close up shop, and encourage everybody to head over to Lions247.com for the latest on the portal, on recruiting, on team development, and of course this defensive coordinator search, which is kind of hanging over our heads right now as they look to fill that.
Really just got to echo the sentiment you just laid out. Stay tuned, because we've got a ton coming with this DC hire. You've got junior days right around the corner, which I'm looking forward to diving into you with in greater detail in the coming days and weeks. But DC search at the forefront right now. We've got you covered with the latest. We're working our asses off, and we're doing what we got to do. So stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. And we'll also got a lot of kind of roster reset type pieces coming your way as we get a feel for what these position rooms are going to look like in 2025, where the key battles are going to be, where we think some of the strengths and weaknesses are. A lot coming your way, although we're settling into the offseason a bit from a football perspective. You should know by now, modern college football really does not have an area of rest on the calendar at this stage, and we do our best to keep up with it at Lions247.com. On behalf of Tyler Calvaruso, I am Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.